somewhere deep in the Pacific, a prehistoric creature stirs. Reports of a strange phenomenon are accompanied by massive loss of life, and one survivor drifts ashore at a nearby island whispering fearfully of a giant sea monster. The islanders declare the creature to be one of their own pseudo-deities called Godzilla, and after reporters come to investigate, the enormous beast rampages through the island, destroying homes and killing with impunity. The Japanese government is pressed for disaster relief, and so they send a paleontologist to the ravaged island, Dr. Yamane, who determines that Godzilla is some kind of ancient dinosaur irradiated by the H-bomb. Yamane implores the government to study the animal, but with more ships disappearing, fish becoming too radioactive to eat, and the death toll rising at an astounding rate, the government decides to use depth charges to kill Godzilla. Instead of bringing an end to the threat, though, the attack only serves to anger the beast and start him on an even more devastating onslaught through the capital city of Tokyo. After this apocalyptic counterattack, Yamane's colleague, the scientist Dr. Serizawa, embroiled in a love triangle with Yamane's daughter Emiko and a handsome ship captain named Ogata, comes forward with a frightening weapon called the Oxygen Destroyer that could, in theory, destroy Godzilla. He is hesitant to let it be used, because in the wrong hands, the Oxygen Destroyer would be more catastrophic and dangerous than even the H-bomb. Meanwhile, Godzilla waits in Tokyo Bay, preparing for another assault on the mainland, ready to ruin Japan forever. In the early years of the Cold War, the United States began nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean. One of the most infamous tests, codenamed Castle Bravo, took place off the coast of Bikini Atoll, an island that the American military used as a regular test site for over 20 different atomic detonations. Castle Bravo was the first American detonation of a dry-fuel hydrogen bomb, which proved to be a far more powerful weapon than its designers anticipated, resulting in an explosion about 1,000 times more powerful than either of the bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The resulting fallout reached a Japanese fishing boat called the Daiko Fukuryo Maru, or Lucky Dragon No. 5. The crew suffered acute radiation sickness, compounded by accidental exposure to hepatitis C during blood transfusion treatments, resulting in one direct fatality and several long-term medical complications for the remaining survivors. This incident had a profound and immediate effect on the Japanese psyche, which was still reeling from the fallout of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and got the attention of Japanese film producer Tomoyuki Tanaka. Tanaka got the idea to make a film that personified nuclear horror in the shape of a giant monster, inspired by America's own The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and he went to his superiors at Toho Studios and pitched the concept. Toho brought on special effects legend Eiji Tsuburaya, genius composer Akira Ifukube, and a director by the name of Ishiro Honda. Honda was a war veteran who had spent a year in a Chinese POW camp and had, since returning from the war, become a noted director of documentaries and national propaganda films. With the help of Takayo Murata, Honda reworked the preliminary screenplays for Tanaka's project, then known as Project G, into one coherent story, which he called Gojira. When Gojira was first released in Japan in 1954, it grossed about 183 million yen, roughly $500,000 using 1954 exchange rates, which was a decent profit from a budget of 100 million yen, though not even close to the country's best performer that year. Japanese critics weren't particularly kind to it, calling it absurd and exploitative. It wasn't a total failure, though, and it planted the seeds for a whole new subgenre of Japanese film, kaiju tokusatsu, giant monster sci-fi spectacles, though it would take decades for that genre to be widely accepted by Japanese film critics. Meanwhile, here in the States in 1955, a man named Edmund Goldman saw Gojira in a Chinatown theater, loved it, and saw its financial potential. He purchased the North American distribution rights for a licensing fee of $25,000, which was a pretty hefty price at the time, and went into business with a small production company called Jewel Enterprises to organize a nationwide release. Goldman's original plan was to subtitle the film, but in those days, subtitled productions tended to bomb at the box office, whereas a well-dubbed foreign film could make over $1 million if properly marketed. Dubbing was far more expensive than subtitling, of course, it still is, and as such it wasn't done too often. Culturally, the practice was seen very differently in those days, and while modern film snobs like myself treat dubbing like some kind of sacrilegious obscenity, going through the trouble to dub over dialogue in a native tongue to ensure it reaches a broader audience was seen then as a mark of honor, a sign of faith in a production. It was treated in almost the exact opposite way it is now. Distributors that dubbed foreign films were thought of as culturally sensitive and globally minded, whereas subtitled productions were seen as lazy, disrespectful cash grabs. The owners of Jewel Enterprises, Richard Kay and Harold Ross, were certain Gojira would more than earn its money back if dubbed, and so they showed it to pioneer film distributor Joseph E. Levine, who was well known for making massive profits by dubbing foreign imports. Levine loved Gojira so much, he envisioned going even further, investing over $100,000 to not only dub the film, but give it a complete makeover. He wanted to re-edit the movie in such a way that it would thrill American audiences, but also respect Ishiro Honda's vision. Levine, Kay, Ross, and Goldman then founded a partnership called Trans World Enterprises, with the sole purpose of bringing Gojira to America. To direct the project, they brought on Terry O. Morse, a director/editor who had been working as a film doctor, which is someone who takes a deeply troubled production, edits the heck out of it, films new sequences, replaces actors, rebuilds sets, re-records audio, and much more, to make what would otherwise be a total loss for the studio into a decent, profitable picture. His job for Transworld Enterprises was to use his skill set to rework Gojira into Godzilla, King of the Monsters, to bring in a new narrator character, find clever ways to insert him into the action, direct new scenes, decide when and where to dub, etc. For the new star of the picture, the American reporter Steve Martin, they hired Raymond Burr, a character actor at the time known for roles as beefy criminals and mobsters in films like His Kind of Woman and Fritz Lang's M, though he is perhaps most famous for his performance in Hitchcock's Rear Window. It was an unusual casting choice, but as the role called for significant narration, Morse chose Burr almost exclusively for his voice.
Neither man nor his machines are able to stop this creature.
Burr only worked on the film for 3 out of the mere 5 days of shooting, and he thus had enough free time in the same month to audition for the title role in a little television pilot called Perry Mason. In the years that followed, and despite how briefly he actually worked on it, he considered the Americanized Godzilla to be a great film he was proud to be a part of. A handful of Eastern-looking American actors were also brought in to play secondary parts, the largest going to California native Frank Iwanaga as security officer Tomo. Body doubles were carefully selected and given matching clothing for reverse shots with Burr to complete the illusion of Steve Martin interacting with the Japanese characters in the original film, and sets were meticulously recreated so that audiences would scarcely notice the difference. The editing skill on display is impressive, so much so that audiences assumed Raymond Burr had flown to Japan and been part of the Japanese production from the start. It's notable that, rather than dubbing all the Japanese characters, they only dubbed where they had to, letting most of the Japanese dialogue be conveyed through a translator, if at all. Unfortunately, if you know a little Japanese, you'll figure out rather quickly that Godzilla King of the Monsters was created for audiences that don't. When Japanese characters speak their native tongue, they might be edited mid-sentence, turning their dialogue into gibberish, and when their words are translated by the film's interpreter or the narration, the translations almost never match. Also, the dubbing, when it occurs, is pretty terrible. Not only does the translation fail to hold up, but there is no synchronization, no attempt to make it look like the Japanese actors are actually saying the English lines. Looping, the standard practice of showing a scene to a voice actor on a loop so they can match the lip movements of the physical actor, wasn't done for Godzilla, and the people who did the vocal performances didn't even know what they were recording lines for. As for the dramatic themes of Gojira, they're mostly intact. Godzilla, King of the Monsters, makes no change that alters Gojira's intent. In fact, it goes out of its way to tell the same story. There were a few brutal cuts designed to get the film down to under 90 minutes so it could play as a double feature, with expository scenes as the primary victim. As a result, nearly every mention of nuclear bombs and Japan's past experience with them are on the cutting room floor. But these excisions don't take much away from the film's message. Contrary to what modern academics like to think, I seriously doubt American audiences in the 1950s watched Godzilla King of the Monsters and failed to understand that it was a film about the nuclear bomb. American sci-fi of the time was overflowing with films dealing with identical subtext, and the origin of Godzilla isn't altered in any way by Morse's edits and inserts. The message might be less explicit, but is still absolutely there for all to see. Ishiro Honda, when he made the original Gojira, was careful to never blame America for the H-bomb testing that both inspired his film and served within it as the origin of his monster. The original Gojira, if anything, treats the nuclear problem as a global one, with responsibility shared by all. One line of dialogue that was cut from Dr. Serizawa, the wounded scientist who represents scientific progress itself, did put more emphasis on blaming the world's military and the arms race, which puts implicit blame on both America and the Soviet Union without actually naming them. Removing this is evidence of a slight change that serves a political purpose, as broad American audiences in the 1950s were, generally speaking, far too invested in the Cold War to easily embrace Honda's anti-military ideas. That said, this change is relatively minor in the grand scheme of things. For an example of a similar pseudo-adaptation whose changes are far more political and far more damning, you don't even have to change franchises. The mid-80s American re-edit of the Japanese Gojira reboot/sequel of that time, called simply Godzilla 1985 and also featuring Raymond Burr, does far more violence to the source film's themes for the sake of saving face, and it stands in stark contrast to this version as an example of how to disrespect the source material instead of honoring it the way Morse did with Godzilla King of the Monsters. Godzilla King of the Monsters hit theaters in 1956 and amassed over $2 million in its initial run. It was such an enormous success that European distributors wanted in on the action. The Americanized Godzilla stomped his way across Europe, dubbed a second time into French, Italian, Spanish, and several other languages. It even eventually made its way back to Japan, where it's known as Kaiju o Gojira, or Monster King Godzilla. It made more money and had more international worldwide impact than the unaltered Gojira ever dreamed of, becoming a cinematic phenomenon almost unprecedented in its reach and scope. In fact, Western audiences wouldn't have easy access to the Japanese version of the film until the early years of the 21st century. The 1956 edit came out in a time of transition, though, with the rise of both the art house circuit and exploitation cinema just around the corner. Not long after Godzilla roared his way across planet Earth, the perception of such drastic alterations to a foreign work of art shifted dramatically, to the point that, by as early as the mid-60s, film historians were looking at King of the Monsters as an embarrassment, as an example of Western culture crapping all over Eastern culture. But that ignores the context of the time in which it was made. Godzilla King of the Monsters never once insults Japanese culture. It never once displays any kind of Western superiority. It doesn't seek to minimize or satirize the Eastern values expressed in Honda's original film. It doesn't replace Japanese actors with American ones. It doesn't inject American political concerns or messages into the story. It doesn't even fall victim to the white savior trope. Steve Martin takes no direct action in the film. He simply observes and comments. The one time in the story he voices a desire to help, he is badly injured and urged to stay in bed. He is nothing more than a lens through which Americans can experience a critical work of Japanese culture. He even does a good job helping American audiences experience the devastation and helplessness Japanese audiences felt when faced with such a brutal analog for their recent national trauma. Modern culture warriors determined to find whitewashing will have an awfully hard time with this film, and though they may call it problematic out of reflex, they would be doing a disservice to how important Godzilla King of the Monsters was in building a great bridge across the Pacific Ocean, uniting American and Japanese culture in a way that still binds us today. It helped heal a wound that was still very much open after World War II. It helped America come to grips with what had happened, what it had done, and how it had impacted Japan. It made Americans less afraid of the Japanese and more sympathetic of them, and though Gojira wasn't created by Honda as an effort to spread Japanese culture, if anything, he was trying to exorcise demons unique to Japan's collective psyche, he made something that spoke to the entire world. If Edmund Goldman had simply subtitled the film and released it that way, it might have made a splash in academic circles and with Hollywood elites, the way Rashomon had done a few years earlier, but it never would have gone further than that. It never would have made an impact on Western culture. Don't criticize the Americanization of the film for trying to put things in a package that could be more easily delivered to audiences of the time, because when you do, you forget how well that package was delivered and how powerful its message is. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. I've been a Godzilla fan for most of my life, and this was a particularly fun review for me to put together. If you'd like me to cover more Godzilla in the future, which I'd be more than happy to do, please let me know in the comments. If you like what I'm doing here, please give this video a like and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Also be sure to check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos, vote on future reviews, and a lot more. For written reviews of many more science fiction classics in film and literature, including a breakdown of every single Godzilla film, be sure to visit my website at emcgill.com. Until next time, this is The Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
me.